3 years ago, Meta looked like a company that had lost its way. Investors were frustrated, critics were getting louder, and billions of dollars were being poured into a vision that many people simply did not understand: the Metaverse. Quarter after quarter, losses mounted. Wall Street questioned the strategy, and Meta stock suffered one of the most dramatic declines in the company's history. To many people, the story seemed obvious. A technology giant had become distracted by an expensive dream. But what if that wasn't the real story? Because while the world was focused on virtual reality headsets and digital worlds, something far more important was happening behind the scenes. Something that would quietly transform Meta into one of the most aggressive artificial intelligence companies on the planet. And the most surprising part? Meta's AI strategy may have never been about selling AI at all. It may have been about protecting the business empire that already makes the company billions of dollars every year. This is the untold story of Meta's secret AI plan. 3 years ago, Meta looked like a company that had lost its way. Investors were frustrated, critics were becoming louder, and Wall Street was beginning to question whether one of the most successful technology companies in history had made a costly strategic mistake. For years, Meta had been viewed as one of the dominant forces of the internet age. Its platforms connected billions of people. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger had become woven into the daily lives of users around the world. The company generated enormous profits through digital advertising, turning attention into one of the most valuable commodities in modern business. But by 2022, the story had changed. Growth was slowing, competition was intensifying, and investors were becoming increasingly concerned about a bold new vision championed by CEO Mark Zuckerberg: the Metaverse. Meta was spending billions of dollars pursuing a future that many people struggled to understand. Virtual reality headsets, digital worlds, and immersive online experiences were consuming vast amounts of capital. At the same time, Reality Labs, the division responsible for these efforts, was reporting staggering losses. Quarter after quarter, billions of dollars disappeared. To many observers, it looked like Meta was abandoning a highly profitable business in exchange for an uncertain dream. The market responded harshly. Meta's stock price suffered one of the most dramatic declines in the company's history. Financial news outlets questioned management decisions. Analysts debated whether Zuckerberg had become too focused on a vision that might never materialize. And for the first time in many years, confidence in Meta appeared shaken. The narrative seemed straightforward. A technology giant had become distracted. A successful company was spending enormous amounts of money on an idea that consumers were not embracing, and investors were paying the price. But sometimes the most obvious explanation is not the correct one. Because while headlines focused on virtual reality and the Metaverse, something much more important was happening beneath the surface, something that would eventually reshape how investors viewed the company. Something that would transform Meta's future, and something that many people completely missed. To understand why, we need to go back and examine the pressures Meta was facing during this period, because the challenges confronting the company were far greater than many realized. Meta's core business depended on one thing above all else: advertising. Every day, billions of users opened Facebook, Instagram, Messenger, and WhatsApp. Every interaction generated data. Every click, every scroll, every engagement signal helped advertisers reach potential customers more effectively. This business model was incredibly successful. The more accurately Meta could understand user behavior, the more valuable its advertising platform became. For years, this system generated extraordinary financial results. Advertisers spent billions of dollars because Meta's platforms delivered measurable outcomes. The company wasn't simply selling advertisements, it was selling precision. It was selling the ability to connect businesses with the right people at the right time. And for a long period, few companies could compete with that capability. But the digital landscape was changing. Consumer behavior was evolving, competition was increasing, and regulatory scrutiny was becoming more intense. The environment that had helped Meta dominate social media was becoming far more complicated. Meanwhile, a new generation of platforms was attracting younger users. Short-form video was reshaping online engagement. Attention was becoming harder to capture. And in the technology industry, attention is everything. Because attention drives engagement. Engagement drives advertising performance, and advertising performance drives revenue. Any threat to attention ultimately becomes a threat to the business itself. Meta understood this reality better than almost anyone. The company had spent years optimizing algorithms designed to maximize engagement across its platforms. It knew exactly how valuable user attention could be, and it also understood the dangers of losing it. That is why the events that followed would become so significant, because Meta wasn't simply facing competitive pressure. It was facing a potential shift in the foundations of its business model. The risks were growing, the challenges were multiplying, and investors were becoming increasingly uncertain about what came next. At the same time, technology itself was entering a new phase. Artificial intelligence was beginning to advance at a remarkable pace. Machine learning systems were becoming more sophisticated, large-scale computing infrastructure was expanding, and the technological race was quietly emerging among some of the world's largest companies. Most people didn't notice at first. The headlines were focused elsewhere. But inside major technology firms, executives were already thinking about how artificial intelligence might reshape the future of the company. Meta was no exception. In fact, some of the decisions that appeared confusing to outsiders were connected to a much larger strategic vision, a vision that would eventually place artificial intelligence at the center of the company's future. But before that transformation could happen, Meta would first have to survive one of the most difficult periods in its history. The company was about to face a series of challenges that would force leadership to rethink priorities, restructure operations, and make decisions that many observers initially misunderstood. And those decisions would ultimately lay the foundation for what may become one of the most ambitious AI strategies in the technology industry. The question is not whether Meta recognized the importance of artificial intelligence. The question is when, and more importantly, why. Because as we'll discover, Meta's AI strategy may have far less to do with selling artificial intelligence than most people think, and far more to do with protecting the business empire that made the company successful in the first place. To understand that story, we first need to examine the events that pushed Meta into a corner and forced the company to adapt. And that story begins with a change that sent shockwaves throughout the digital advertising industry. The event that changed everything did not originate inside Meta. It came from another technology giant, Apple. For years, companies like Meta relied heavily on data signals that helped advertisers measure performance across the internet. When someone viewed an advertisement, clicked a product, visited a website, or made a purchase, those actions generated valuable information. That information helped advertising platforms improve targeting and demonstrate results to businesses. The system wasn't perfect, but it was incredibly effective. Advertisers could spend money with confidence because they could track outcomes. Meta benefited enormously from this model. Its advertising engine became one of the most sophisticated marketing systems ever created. But then, Apple introduced a major privacy change. A feature known as App Tracking Transparency required users to actively choose whether applications could track activity across other apps and websites. On the surface, it sounded like a simple privacy update. For consumers, it offered greater control over personal data. But for the digital advertising industry, the consequences were enormous. Many users chose not to allow tracking. As a result, advertising platforms lost access to important signals that had previously helped measure and optimize campaigns. Suddenly, advertisers had less visibility. Targeting became more difficult. Performance measurement became less precise. And one of Meta's greatest competitive advantages came under pressure. The financial impact was significant. Meta publicly acknowledged that Apple's changes would create billions of dollars in headwinds for the business. Investors immediately understood the seriousness of the situation. If Meta's advertising system became less effective, growth could slow. And if growth slowed, future profitability could be affected. For a company whose business depended on advertising efficiency, this represented a genuine threat. Yet Apple's privacy changes were only one part of the problem. At the same time, another competitor was rapidly gaining momentum: TikTok. What initially appeared to be a niche video sharing platform was evolving into something much larger. Its recommendation engine was remarkably effective. Users spent countless hours scrolling through short videos. Engagement levels soared, and younger audiences increasingly gravitated toward the platform. This mattered because attention is the currency of the digital economy. Every minute spent on TikTok was a minute not spent on Instagram or Facebook. Every shift in user behavior had potential consequences for advertising revenue. Meta could see what was happening. The company understood that consumer preferences were changing. Traditional social networking was no longer the only game in town. Short-form video had become one of the most important battlegrounds in technology. And TikTok was winning. For the first time in years, Meta found itself reacting rather than leading. The company launched Reels to compete. It adjusted algorithms. It invested heavily in video recommendations. But investors remained concerned because now Meta was fighting challenges on multiple fronts. Apple's privacy changes were reducing advertising efficiency. TikTok was competing for user attention. Regulators were increasing scrutiny. And the company was simultaneously spending billions on the metaverse. From the outside, it looked overwhelming. The market began questioning whether Meta's best days were behind it. Some analysts argued that the company's growth story was ending. Others wondered whether social media itself was becoming less valuable. And many investors simply wanted answers. How would Meta adapt? How would it defend its advertising business? How would it compete in a rapidly changing digital landscape? The answers would eventually emerge, but not immediately, because before Meta could execute a new strategy, it first needed to confront reality. The company had become larger, more complex, and more expensive. Costs were rising, investments were accelerating, and shareholders were demanding greater discipline. In response, Meta initiated a series of significant changes. The company reduced expenses, it streamlined operations, and it began focusing more aggressively on efficiency. Mark Zuckerberg would later describe this period as a year of efficiency. The phrase quickly became associated with Meta's effort to restore investor confidence. But there was another reason these changes mattered. Efficiency wasn't just about cutting costs. It was about creating room for future investments, massive future investments. Because while the public conversation focused on layoffs and spending reductions, Meta was preparing for something else entirely: artificial intelligence. The company had already spent years developing machine learning systems. In fact, many people underestimated how deeply AI was embedded within Meta's products. Recommendation algorithms, content ranking systems, advertising optimization tools, spam detection, safety systems. AI was already everywhere inside the company. But leadership believed the next generation of AI would be different, much more powerful, much more expensive, and potentially transformative. To compete in that future, Meta would need extraordinary computing power. It would need infrastructure, data centers, advanced hardware, research talent, and long-term commitment. The challenge was that these investments would require billions of dollars, at a time when investors were already questioning management decisions. This created a difficult balancing act. Meta had to convince shareholders that current spending would generate future value. It had to explain why billions invested today might strengthen the company tomorrow, and it had to do so while confidence was already fragile. Many companies would have chosen caution. Many executives would have slowed investment plans. But Meta chose a different path, a path that would eventually lead directly into the emerging AI race. And as artificial intelligence captured global attention, one company would dominate headlines, a company that seemed to demonstrate a glimpse of the future. A company called OpenAI. The arrival of ChatGPT would change public perceptions of artificial intelligence almost overnight. Suddenly, AI was no longer a niche technology topic. It became a global phenomenon. Businesses paid attention, investors paid attention, governments paid attention, and perhaps most importantly, Meta paid attention. Because while the world was becoming fascinated by what OpenAI was building, Meta was developing a very different vision for how artificial intelligence would shape the future. A vision that would ultimately reveal why the company's strategy was unlike almost anything else in the industry. And that story begins with one of the most controversial bets in modern technology history: the Metaverse. By the time Meta fully committed to the Metaverse vision, the reaction from Wall Street was already divided. Some investors saw it as a bold attempt to define the next computing platform. Others saw it as an expensive distraction from a highly profitable core business. But regardless of opinion, one fact was undeniable. The financial scale of the investment was enormous. Meta began pouring billions of dollars into Reality Labs, the division responsible for virtual reality hardware, augmented reality research, and immersive digital environments. The goal was ambitious: to build the next generation of computing experience, a world where users could interact not through traditional screens, but through fully immersive digital spaces. Headsets, avatars, and virtual environments would replace many of the interfaces people use today. At least that was the long-term vision. In the short term, however, the results were far less impressive. Reality Labs began reporting substantial losses, not just small losses, but multi-billion-dollar quarterly losses that continued for years. Each earnings report reinforced the same message. The Metaverse was not yet a profitable business, and there was no clear timeline for when it would become one. For investors, this created a growing sense of frustration, because unlike other technology investments that showed incremental progress, the Metaverse required long-term belief. There were no immediate revenue streams at scale, no clear monetization model comparable to Meta's advertising business, and no certainty that consumer demand would match the scale of investment. As a result, Meta stock began to reflect this uncertainty. The market struggled to assign value to a business simultaneously generating massive profits in advertising while also burning billions in speculative research. The contradiction created volatility, and volatility often leads to doubt. Critics argued that Zuckerberg had become too focused on a personal vision of the future. Some suggested that Meta was effectively subsidizing an experimental technology at the expense of shareholder returns. Others questioned whether consumers actually wanted to spend significant time in virtual reality environments. The skepticism was not without justification. Adoption of VR hardware remained limited compared to traditional smartphones. The ecosystem was still developing, and the broader concept of the metaverse remained abstract for many people outside the technology industry. But internally, Meta's leadership saw something different. They viewed the metaverse not as a single product, but as a long-term platform shift, a potential successor to mobile computing, a new layer of digital interaction that could eventually reshape how people communicate, work, and play. To support that vision, Meta continued investing heavily in hardware development, content tools, and foundational infrastructure. But something important was happening in parallel that most external observers did not fully appreciate. While Reality Labs consumed headlines, Meta's core advertising business was evolving in a different direction. Behind the scenes, the company was increasingly focused on improving the intelligence of its systems. Recommendation algorithms became more sophisticated, content ranking models improved, advertising optimization systems became more automated, and machine learning began playing a larger role in nearly every part of the platform. In other words, while the metaverse represented one vision of the future, artificial intelligence was already transforming existing systems in real time. This dual-track strategy created confusion among investors. On one hand, Meta appeared to be investing heavily in a long-term hardware platform that might take years to mature. On the other hand, it was simultaneously advancing some of the most important software capabilities in the industry. At first glance, these two directions seemed unrelated, but there was a deeper connection, because both the metaverse and artificial intelligence required massive computational infrastructure. Both demanded cutting-edge research in machine learning and graphics, and both required Meta to think far beyond its existing business model. However, the key difference lay in timing. The metaverse represented a long-term bet on how humans might interact in the future. Artificial intelligence, on the other hand, was already transforming existing systems in real time. This distinction would eventually become critical, because while the metaverse was still searching for product-market fit, artificial intelligence was rapidly becoming a foundational technology across the entire industry. And as companies like OpenAI began demonstrating the power of large language models, the perception of AI shifted dramatically. It was no longer just a back-end tool for recommendations or ad optimization.
It was becoming a general-purpose technology with broad applications. This shift forced every major technology company to reassess its priorities, including Meta. But the company was not starting from zero. In fact, many of the systems it had already built for advertising, content ranking, and personalization were deeply rooted in machine learning. Meta already understood how to train large-scale models. It already operated massive data infrastructure, and it already had access to one of the largest datasets in the world, user behavior across its platforms. What changed was not Meta's capability. What changed was the perceived importance of artificial intelligence. Suddenly, AI was no longer just a supporting technology. It was becoming a central battleground of the entire industry. And this realization would force Meta into one of the most important strategic shifts in its history, a shift that many observers initially misunderstood. Because while the company had been publicly associated with the metaverse, internally, a different priority was beginning to rise, one that would eventually redefine Meta's future and reshape how investors viewed the entire company. That priority was artificial intelligence, but not in the way most people expected. Because Meta's approach to AI would begin with not a consumer product designed to compete directly with chatbots. It would begin with something far more subtle and far more powerful. The transformation was about to begin.
For years, artificial intelligence inside Meta had been developing quietly in the background. It was not the headline product, it was not the business focus discussed in earnings calls, and it was not the vision that dominated public attention. That attention belonged to the metaverse. But internally, AI was already deeply embedded into almost every major system the company operated. From ranking posts on Facebook and Instagram to optimizing ad delivery to filtering harmful content, machine learning models were already making billions of micro-decisions every second. This meant Meta was not new to AI. It was already one of the largest real-world AI operators in the world. However, what changed in 2022 and 2023 was not Meta's capability. It was the external perception of AI itself. When OpenAI released ChatGPT, something fundamental shifted in the technology landscape. Artificial intelligence was no longer viewed as a background optimization tool. It became a product category on its own, a direct interface between humans and machines, a new computing paradigm. And suddenly, every major technology company had to respond. Google accelerated its AI efforts. Microsoft deepened its partnership with OpenAI. Startups rushed to build competing models, and investors began asking a simple question: who will control the future of artificial intelligence? Meta's answer was unexpected. Instead of immediately launching a consumer chatbot designed to compete directly with ChatGPT, Meta chose a different direction and more open approach. The company introduced Llama, a large language model released with a partially open research-focused strategy. This decision surprised many observers because it did not follow the typical path of tightly controlled product-first AI development. Instead, Meta allowed researchers, developers, and institutions to access and build on top of its models. At first glance, this seemed like a disadvantage. OpenAI had a clear consumer product. ChatGPT was becoming widely recognized and rapidly adopted. Google was integrating AI into search and productivity tools. Meta, by contrast, did not immediately present a dominant consumer application. But internally, this strategy was intentional. Meta was not trying to win the AI race in the same way as others. It was trying to shape the foundation on which that race would be built. By open sourcing parts of its AI research, Meta accelerated adoption among developers. It increased external experimentation. It encouraged improvements from the broader research community, and it positioned itself as a core infrastructure player in the AI ecosystem. This approach aligns with Meta's broader business philosophy. Unlike companies that monetize directly through subscriptions or enterprise software, Meta's core revenue comes from advertising, and advertising depends on scale. More users, more engagement, more data, more interactions. So rather than restricting access to AI capabilities, Meta had an incentive to expand them. The more widely its AI systems were used and improved, the more powerful its underlying infrastructure became. But this strategy also carried risks. Open models meant less direct control over applications built on top of them, and it meant Meta would not immediately dominate the public perception of consumer AI products.
Instead, companies like OpenAI and Google would receive more attention for their visible AI interfaces. This created a subtle but important divergence in strategy. OpenAI focused on user-facing intelligence. Google focused on integrated search and productivity intelligence. Meta focused on distributed intelligence across massive social and advertising networks. And that distinction is critical to understanding what came next. Because while the public debate centered on chatbots and AI assistants, Meta was building something more foundational. A system designed not just to answer questions, but to understand human behavior at scale, to predict attention, to optimize engagement, and to improve the efficiency of the largest advertising ecosystem in the world. This is where the real shift begins, because Meta's AI strategy was not just about competing in artificial intelligence. It was about strengthening the most valuable part of its existing business, advertising. Every improvement in machine learning translated directly into better ad targeting. Better targeting meant better conversion rates. Better conversion rates meant more revenue per impression. And more revenue meant stronger long-term profitability. In other words, AI was not a separate business for Meta. It was an upgrade layer for its core business model. This realization reframes the entire narrative. Meta was not simply reacting to OpenAI. It was not trying to copy Google. And it was not abandoning its previous strategy entirely. Instead, it was integrating AI into the system that already generated nearly all of its profits. But this was only the beginning, because the most important question had not yet been answered. If AI was so critical to Meta's future, why did the company not make it the central public narrative immediately? Why continue to emphasize the metaverse as AI capabilities were accelerating internally? The answer lies in timing, infrastructure, and strategic positioning. And understanding that answer reveals the real purpose behind Meta's AI transformation. A transformation that most investors did not fully recognize at the time, and one that would ultimately redefine how the company competes in the global technology landscape. But to understand the full impact of this strategy, we must now examine what happens when AI meets the world's largest attention network, because that's where Meta's true advantage begins to emerge, and where the biggest misconception about the company finally becomes clear.
Up to this point, the story seems to be about competition in artificial intelligence. Meta versus OpenAI. Meta versus Google. Meta trying to keep pace in a rapidly changing industry. But this is where the narrative shifts, because the real question is not whether Meta is building advanced AI systems. The real question is why, and the answer is not what most people expect. Meta is not primarily in the business of selling artificial intelligence. It never has been. Meta is in the business of selling attention. Every product the company builds ultimately feeds into one core system, a global advertising engine designed to capture, predict, and monetize human attention at scale. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger are not just social platforms. They are data generation systems. Every like, scroll, pause, message, and interaction becomes a signal. And those signals are incredibly valuable because they allow Meta to do something extremely powerful: predict behavior. This is where artificial intelligence becomes critical, not as a standalone product, but as an internal upgrade to the advertising machine. The better Meta can understand users, the more effectively it can serve ads. The more effectively it serves ads, the more valuable its platform becomes. And the more valuable the platform becomes, the stronger its financial position grows. This creates a feedback loop. More users generate more data. More data improves AI systems. Better AI systems improves advertising performance. Better advertising performance increases revenue. Increased revenue funds more AI investment. This is the core engine of Meta's business, and that explains why AI is so strategically important to the company. Because AI does not just improve products, it improves the efficiency of the entire business model. Now, the earlier decisions begin to make more sense. Why Meta invested heavily in machine learning long before AI became a public trend. Why recommendation systems became increasingly sophisticated. Why content ranking and personalization became so advanced. And why the company quietly built some of the largest data infrastructure systems in the world. All of it was preparing for this moment, when artificial intelligence would become powerful enough to significantly enhance prediction systems at scale. But there is another layer to the story, one that most investors initially overlooked. If Meta's real value comes from advertising efficiency, then AI is not the end product, it is the optimization layer, the invisible engine behind every ad impression. This means Meta does not necessarily need to win the AI race, in the same way as companies like OpenAI. It does not need to dominate consumer chat interfaces, and it does not need to sell AI subscriptions directly to users. Instead, it benefits from AI in a different way, silently, systematically, at scale. Every improvement in model accuracy translates directly into higher advertising returns. Even small gains in prediction accuracy can produce enormous financial impact when applied across billions of users. This is why Meta's strategy begins to look different from its competitors. While other companies compete to build the most visible AI products, Meta focuses on integrating AI into the background systems that already generate revenue. This is also why the company can justify massive investments in infrastructure. Data centers, GPUs, and AI research teams are not speculative bets in Meta's case. They are capital expenditures aimed at improving a proven revenue machine. However, this strategy also creates a perception problem. To external observers, Meta appears to be spending heavily on AI without a clear consumer product strategy. But internally, the logic is different. The product already exists. It is the advertising system. AI is simply making it more efficient. This distinction is critical because it reframes Meta's entire position in the AI landscape. The company is not trying to reinvent itself as an AI product company. It is trying to enhance its existing identity as the world's largest attention and advertising network. And that brings us to a deeper realization. The real competition in AI is not just about who builds the most advanced model. It is about who integrates intelligence most effectively into existing systems of value. For Meta, that system is advertising, and that's where its true advantage lies. Billions of users, decades of behavioral data, and one of the most optimized digital advertising infrastructures ever created. When AI is applied to that system, even marginal improvements become extremely valuable. This is the part of the story most investors initially misunderstood. They saw Meta as reacting to OpenAI. They saw uncertainty in the Metaverse investments. They saw rising costs and strategic complexity, but they did not fully see the underlying transformation. Meta was not abandoning its core business, it was upgrading it. And as artificial intelligence continues to evolve, that upgrade becomes more significant. Because the companies that win in the next phase of technology will not necessarily be those that build AI first. They will be the ones that apply it most effectively to existing systems that generate massive value. And Meta already owns one of the most powerful systems in existence. But this still leaves an important question unanswered. If Meta's strategy is so fundamentally tied to advertising efficiency, how does it position itself against companies like OpenAI and Google? And more importantly, what does that mean for investors trying to understand Meta's long-term potential? To answer that, we need to zoom out, because the competition is not just technological, it's structural. And the next part of the story reveals how different AI strategies collide in the real world of capital markets, product ecosystems, and global attention. That's where the real battle begins. By this point, the narrative around Meta becomes more complex, because once artificial intelligence enters the picture, the company is no longer being evaluated on a single dimension. It is no longer just a social media company. It is not purely a metaverse investor, and it is not simply reacting to market trends. Instead, Meta becomes part of a much larger competitive landscape, one where the rules are still being written. On one side, there is OpenAI, a company focused on building general-purpose artificial intelligence systems designed for direct human interaction. ChatGPT represents a new kind of product, a conversational interface that allows users to access knowledge, generate content, and interact with AI in a fluid way. This positions OpenAI as a leader in consumer-facing artificial intelligence. On another side, there is Google, a company deeply integrated into search, productivity tools, and global information systems. Google's advantage lies in distribution. Its AI systems are embedded into search engines, email platforms, cloud infrastructure, and enterprise tools. This gives it a massive ecosystem advantage. Then there is Meta, a company with a very different structure. Meta does not primarily monetize through subscriptions or enterprise software. It monetizes through attention. And this difference changes everything. Because while OpenAI and Google are focused on building AI products that users directly interact with, Meta is focused on building AI systems that operate behind the scenes. Systems that improve engagement, systems that optimize content delivery, systems that enhance advertising precision. This creates a fundamentally different strategic direction. Meta is not trying to replace human interaction with AI. It is trying to enhance human interaction through AI. This distinction defines the competitive landscape. Now the question becomes, which strategy is more powerful in the long run? To answer that, investors typically evaluate two scenarios: the bull case and the bear case. In the bull case, Meta successfully integrates artificial intelligence into its advertising infrastructure at scale. Even small improvements in targeting accuracy and engagement prediction lead to significant increases in revenue efficiency. With billions of users across its platforms, these marginal gains compound into enormous financial outcomes. In this scenario, Meta does not need to win the AI consumer product race. It simply needs to make its existing business more efficient. And given its scale, even incremental improvements can create billions of dollars in additional value. There is also another element supporting the bull case: Meta's infrastructure advantage. The company operates some of the largest data systems in the world. It has access to unparalleled behavioral datasets, and it has already built a foundation required to train and deploy large-scale machine learning systems. This positions Meta as one of the most capable companies in terms of applied artificial intelligence. However, the bear case presents a different picture. In this scenario, Meta's massive investments in AI infrastructure may not translate into meaningful competitive advantage. If OpenAI or Google define the dominant AI interfaces of the future, user attention could shift away from traditional social platforms. If new AI-native platforms emerge, they could disrupt existing engagement models. And if advertising efficiency gains plateau, the return on AI investment could be lower than expected. There is also regulatory risk. As AI becomes more powerful, governments may increase oversight on data usage, targeting systems, and algorithmic influence. For a company like Meta, which depends heavily on data-driven advertising, this could introduce structural constraints. So, investors are left with a dual reality. On one hand, Meta has one of the most powerful advertising systems ever created. On the other hand, it operates in an environment undergoing rapid technological and regulatory change. Which brings us to the final part of this story, where everything comes together, where the long-term implications of Meta's AI strategy become more clear, and where investors must decide how to interpret everything they have seen so far. Because the final question is not just about Meta, it's about what kind of future artificial intelligence will create, and who will benefit most from that future.
At this point, the story is no longer just about Meta. It is about the direction of the entire technology industry. Artificial intelligence is no longer a future concept. It is already embedded into the systems that shape how billions of people consume information, communicate, and interact online. And Meta sits at the center of one of the largest of those systems. The question now is not what Meta is doing. The question is, what happens next? There are two broad paths the future could take: the bull case and the bear case. In the bull case, Meta successfully completes one of the most important transitions in modern technology. Its advertising system becomes significantly more efficient through artificial intelligence. Even small improvements in prediction accuracy lead to measurable increases in revenue per user. With billions of users across Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger, these improvements compound at scale. The result is a more powerful, more profitable, and more efficient digital advertising machine. In this scenario, Meta does not need to dominate consumer AI products. It does not need to compete directly with OpenAI and chat interfaces, or with Google in search. Instead, it wins through integration. AI becomes deeply embedded into the infrastructure of attention itself, and Meta's position as one of the largest digital attention networks in the world becomes even stronger. There is also a second potential outcome, the bear case. In this scenario, the rapid evolution of artificial intelligence fundamentally reshapes how users interact with digital content. New AI-native platforms emerge that reduce dependence on traditional social feeds. Users increasingly interact with intelligent assistants rather than scrolling through algorithmic content streams. If that shift becomes large enough, it could reduce engagement on traditional social media platforms over time. At the same time, regulatory pressure could increase. Governments may introduce stricter rules around data usage, algorithmic targeting, and advertising transparency. These changes could limit the effectiveness of Meta's core business model. In that world, even strong AI investments may not fully offset structural changes in user behavior and regulation. So, the outcome is not guaranteed, but both scenarios depend on a single underlying factor: attention. Who controls it, who predicts it, and who monetizes it most effectively? This is where Meta's identity becomes important. Meta is not an AI company in the traditional sense. It is not a hardware company. It is not even just a social media company anymore. Meta is an attention infrastructure company, a global system designed to capture human attention, understand it, and convert it into economic value. Artificial intelligence does not replace that system. It enhances it. It makes it more precise, more efficient, more scalable, and potentially more dominant. This is why Meta's strategy can appear confusing from the outside, because it does not fit neatly into the category of an AI product company. It fits into the category of a system optimizer, a company that improves the efficiency of an already massive global network. And when viewed through that lens, the decisions begin to make more sense. The investments in AI infrastructure, the focus on recommendation systems, the emphasis on engagement optimization, and even the earlier Metaverse strategy, which seemed disconnected at the time, all of it reflects a broader attempt to prepare for the next phase of computing, where intelligence is not a product, but a layer across every interaction. For investors, this creates both opportunity and uncertainty. On one hand, Meta already controls one of the most valuable digital ecosystems in the world. On the other hand, the future of attention itself is still evolving, and no company can fully predict how users will behave in 5 or 10 years. This is why Meta remains one of the most closely watched companies in global markets. It sits at the intersection of advertising, social behavior, and artificial intelligence, three forces that are all changing at the same time. And when those forces converge, the outcome is rarely simple. But there is one final insight that brings the entire story together. Meta's secret AI plan is really not about artificial intelligence in isolation. It is about ensuring that as the world becomes more intelligent, its advertising system becomes more intelligent with it. Because in the end, Meta doesn't win by creating the most advanced AI model. It wins by ensuring that intelligence improves the system it already owns. And that system is attention. As we step into the next phase of digital technology, the companies that succeed will not necessarily be the ones that build the most visible products. They will be the ones that control the invisible systems underneath them. And Meta is betting that it already controls one of the most important ones. Whether that bet ultimately succeeds or fails will define not just Meta's future, but a significant part of the future of the digital economy itself. And for investors watching closely, the question remains open. Is Meta building the future of artificial intelligence, or is it simply making the most powerful attention machine ever created even stronger? The answer will not come from announcements or headlines. It will come from results, from usage, from engagement, and from time. But one thing is certain, the transformation is already underway, and it is far from over. Thank you for watching Wealth Buy. If you want more deep dive documentaries like this, subscribe for future breakdowns of the companies shaping the global economy.